Hello and welcome back to another video. I'm making my great return and we're going to be having a first look at an upcoming tier 8 French heavy tank, the Brennos. This tank is a little bit of a peculiar one. It's going to be combining a couple of different things from different nations, but it is a distinctly French heavy tank. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, in terms of its DPM, this tank is going to be lacking. 1700 at tier 8 really is not going to be great. And with its Alpha 320, it is going to feel pretty poor. And you are going to be putting yourself into situations as, a heavy tank at tier 8 where you do just lack DPM. A 10.8-second reload for 320 Alpha just doesn't really particularly give this thing an opportunity to brawl particularly effectively in today's meta where alpha is king instead of lower alpha, faster reload. This thing doesn't really have either. However, its penetration values are kind of a little bit of a slight redeeming factor. There are some tier 8 heavy tanks, yes, they are some of the older ones now, that do lack penetration. 234 standard AP is workable. Not going to be high, not going to be low. Sits bang average. But its gold penetration of 280mm APCR, that is a slight redeeming factor. You just have to look at some tanks like, for example, the IS-6 with its 250mm of gold penetration. And you can kind of start to see how 280 is actually not too terrible nowadays. Obviously, you can't really compare this tank to like the 122 TM, which has 300mm heat. However, for a heavy tank, especially a French heavy tank at tier 8, 280mm is actually quite nice. Gun handling wise, this tank looks kind of meh. It's got a really nice aim time. 1.8 seconds aim time will feel pretty snappy. However, 0.37 dispersion, not particularly the greatest. It will definitely work, and its gun handling will feel okay. However, you will have to run V-stabs on this tank. There is pretty much a world where you have to run with V-stabs. There's no real option there. 10 degrees of gun depression definitely makes it workable, but the gun will feel a little bit derpy, and it will feel a little bit like the AMX M4 MLE, which we will compare this tank directly to in a second. In terms of mobility, 40 forwards is okay. You run a turbo, you're pulling it up to 45-ish. It's not horrendous. Obviously, we don't quite know what field mods this thing's going to get yet. However, less than 50 in terms of mobility in today's meta where games are increasingly speedy, yeah, you will feel like you can't necessarily fight the frontline battle. However, with this thing's DPM, that's probably where you should be on that second line. Hit points, 1500, literally just average for tier 8. That's nothing special. In terms of armor, this thing might be a little bit interesting. It's got kind of a duck-shaped nose, a bill shape. So it's got kind of two angled plates, very similar to tanks like the IS-7, for example. I think this thing will be decent frontally. So if you are exactly front onto your opponent, I think this thing will be pretty okay. However, as soon as you start to angle slightly, or side scrape, I think this thing's armor frontally will be particularly weak. Obviously, I think its lower plate is going to be its big weakness frontally. However, it isn't particularly big. Potentially quite easily to hide on some small rubble piles. But I think its strength is going to be when it is cooldown, when it is facing its opponent directly frontally. I think its hull will be pretty strong. As soon as it turns, that armor will become flat, and then it will be weak. In terms of turret armor, it looks okay. It looks pretty rounded. It looks like there might be some small weak points towards the lower part of the gun, maybe an auto ricochet angle, which penetrates the upper hull. However, I think turret-wise it looks okay. However, as you can see from the image, it has two giant cupolas on top, very similar to tanks like the AMX-30B, the tier 10 French medium. Yeah, this thing will be pretty hard to play in a hull down if you can't hide its cupolas. Because those two cupolas are going to be huge and look pretty weak, so think of that as what you will. And then just randomly view range, 380 meters is actually not terrible for a tier 8 heavy. You will be able to spot some things for yourself at a decent-ish distance. So, let's compare this tank now to two other tanks that are in the game. The AMX M4 MLE, which is the tier 8 French premium medium, and the AMX 65T, which is the tech tree French heavy. So, In terms of DPM, the Brennos is better than the AMX M4, worse than the AMX 65T. It kind of just sits in the lower end of the average in terms of DPM. Alpha 320 is better than the M4, however, it's worse than the 65T. The 65T's 400 is actually quite nice, and it does give it that slightly better DPM. Reload time, once again, the Brennos is sitting smack bang in the middle of the two. 320 Alpha, that gives it its DPM. In terms of dispersion, you can kind of see there. Base values, dispersion, 0.37. It's worse than the 65T and the M4 MLE, and nobody would say that the M4 MLE and the 65T's gun handling is great. So you can kind of see where the Brennos is going to sit. Probably, and in pretty definitely, a contender to run V-stabs on. In terms of aim time, Brennos is worlds ahead. As I said, it will feel really quite snappy. 1.8 seconds, 2.5 seconds, 2.5 seconds. However, it will be this thing's dispersion that lets it down, not necessarily its great aim time, which will boost up its gun handling. In terms of mobility, it's pretty much identical to the M4 MLE, and it's 5 kilometers an hour better than the 65T, 40, 40, 35. In terms of reverse speed, the Brennos is winning with 18 compared to 15 and 15. Reverse speed, obviously not necessarily the most important metric, just more of a quality of life thing. In terms of gun depression, 10 degrees is lovely, same as the M4 MLE, better than the 65T's 8 degrees. This tank also looks pretty tall, pretty huge, so having 10 degrees of gun depression is always quite nice, especially when something tries to face hug you. HP, bang average, 65T gets 1600, the M4 and the Brennos 1500. View range, bang average again. It's the armor where this thing looks interesting. It looks like its armor is going to be incredibly similar to the 65T. However, maybe slightly better because I think its hull armor is slightly better angled. In terms of, for a frontal fight, I feel like its hull armor is going to be slightly stronger. However, on paper, it's weaker. So take that what you wish. Hull armor, yeah, looks pretty standard across the board. Obviously, the M4 MLE has really nice frontal hull armor, however, a really weak lower plate. And also, it's got 2 little side cheek pods that mean it can't side script. So, you know, they look pretty comparable across the board. Same with its turret armor. However, the Brennos does look like it's going to be held back by its 2 pretty huge cupolas, whereas the M4 MLE does have a cupola, which is incredibly weak, but it's smaller, and the 65T, same issue. We can kind of see here where the penetration values of the Brennos are really quite nice. So it's got the best standard pen, 234mm AP, compared to 232 AP and 225 AP, but its gold penetration is where it stands out the best. 280 APCR compared to 263 for the M4 MLE and 252 for the 65T. There comes in that little bit of creep that I said with the penetration values. You know, the 65T and the M4 MLE, similar in age to, for example, tanks like the IS-6, which do really suffer with their penetration nowadays. Brennos coming in as a new tank, has better penetration, and therefore will be a little bit more comfortable to play, especially at tier 8 when you're fighting tier 9 and tier 10 tanks. 280 means you can pretty reliably pen the weak spots of tier 9 heavies and some tier 10 heavy tanks weak spots as well. So 280 is comfortable compared to, 263 and 252. You do really struggle when you get to tier 9 and tier 10. So that's the Brennos. What do I think about this tank? Well, I think it's going to be pretty average. Does it look like it's going to be anything special? No, not really. I think this is just going to be a pretty bang average tier 8 heavy tank that will do decent in tier 8 games. However, when it gets up tiered to tier 9 and tier 10, it will particularly struggle. And if it gets in a scenario where it needs to use DPM, it needs to brawl, maybe use its armor in a kind of dynamic situation, that's where I think this tank will struggle, particularly because it's huge. Its armor doesn't look particularly strong if it's not frontally. It doesn't have the DPM to fight its way out of a brawl. So it kind of seems to be missing its one wow factor. You look at tanks that we've had recently, they've all had a wow factor, one good statistic that kind of mitigates some of their weaker statistics, whether it be DPM or armor. The Brennos doesn't really seem to have any of that. It seems to have weak DPM, weak gun handling, probably pretty weak armor unless it's frontally, and it has got its cupolas which deny it playing it hull down particularly effectively. It's not very quick. You can kind of see where I'm going to give this thing the average tag. I don't think it looks particularly special, but, you make your own decision. Do let me know down in the comments what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree with me? I'd love to hear your opinions. And yeah, I'm back. Sorry, I took a few breaks with a few couple of weeks break with some studies, one of those things. But I'm back and I plan to be back around for a while. So look forward to some more videos every Monday and Friday, as well as the advanced videos on Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday. And I'll see you all again very soon.